Madam President, Excellencies, distinguished members of the Estonian Academy of Science, I want to thank you for offering me the honor to give this year's Endel Lipppmaa lecture to this prominent audience. I'm honored and I'm humbled, and I excuse myself for hiding behind the screen. Endel Lipppmaa was a towering figure in modern Estonian history. He was an accomplished scientist as well as a politician with an impressive career in both Estonian and European politics. He certainly left his mark on history. I believe it will be in the spirit of Endel Lipppmaa when I choose as my theme for today's lecture the challenges facing small nations in the world of today. In particular, how do we defend our democratic values? Both Estonia and Denmark are small countries if you compare ourselves to the size of quite a few other countries. We share a lot. Geography, even though you call the Baltic Sea the Western Sea, we call it the Eastern Sea. But still, we also share a lot of beliefs. And we have for quite some time belonged to the same families, the Northern, the European, and the Atlantic. So we might also share some experiences as to how to deal with the challenges I just spoke about. Well, speaking of size, I was reminded of an observation made by my dear friend Lennart Meri when he was on an official state visit as President of Estonia to Denmark in 1994. He gave a speech at the state dinner our Queen gave to his honor in her summer residence, the Fredensborg Castle. Here he said, "A state with open access to the sea cannot be described as a small state." Oh, I remember him standing there in the great banquet hall, tall and impressive, with the light blue band of our highest Danish order over his shoulder. It was not Lennart Meri's first visit to our Queen's summer residence. And allow me to take you all down a tour of memory lane. It was in the year of 1991. Many of you were probably very young at that time, maybe not even born, but those of us who are of age will never forget how 1991 became a formative year for Estonia, Europe, and the whole Baltic Sea region. After the Oman attacks in January 91 on the TV tower in Vilnius and the Saima in Riga, Denmark signed 3 joint protocols of cooperation with Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And the joint protocol between Estonia and Denmark was signed on March 11th by Lennart Meri and me in our capacity as foreign ministers. Here it was stated that the recognition of Estonia as an independent state from 1921 by Denmark was still valid. Denmark had never recognized the forcible inclusion of Estonia into the Soviet Union, and we intended to re-establish diplomatic relations as soon as the situation made it possible. Well, at that time, not many of us believed this would happen soon, But I tell you, they got hopping mad in Moscow. They called our ambassador up for a verbal bashing, while the Soviet ambassador to Copenhagen, he showed up with a strong protest and thinly veiled threats to make life difficult for us in some areas where we were vulnerable. Well, they never materialized, because in August that year, things started to happen very quickly. The putsch in Moscow started a Monday morning, but on Wednesday it became clear that the putsch had failed. And on Saturday, August the 24th, we were in a position to declare that we were now re-establishing diplomatic relations with the three Baltic countries. 2 days later, the three Baltic foreign ministers came to Copenhagen to sign a joint protocol to confirm this. Our Queen was at that time at her summer residence, the Fredensborg Palace, and she had insisted to receive the foreign ministers there, Lennart Meri, Jānis Jurkans, and Algirdas Saudargas. So late in the evening, we got into a minibus and drove off to Fredensborg Castle. We arrived there at around 11 o'clock in the evening. There was a company of the Royal Lifeguard standing to attention. Their orchestra played a ceremonial march, and there was a full moon. And then Jānis Jurkans said dryly, "Lennart, don't cry." But we were all moved by the moment. And we went into the palace. On the stairs we were welcomed by the royal dog, a yapping dachshund, and by a footman in full gala. And inside was our Queen giving a little speech where she welcomed the three Balts to the free world and gave a glass of champagne. So yes, Lennart Meri had indeed been there before, and he also referred to that event in his speech 3 years later. What followed then was, of course, a very busy time to all of us. It was as if the world had opened up and a lot of dreams were coming through. Francis Fukuyama wrote his famous book about the end of history. And we were all deeply involved in the creation of the new world order and the new European structure. What followed was NATO enlargement and EU enlargement, and optimism was in the driving seat. That was then. Today we are facing a different world. The ideals and the values of European integration, as they were formulated in the so-called Copenhagen criteria, are being attacked both by abroad and from member states. Were we naive at that time when Fukuyama's end of history was exaggerated and misunderstood? To some extent, yes, we were naive, but it was difficult then not to be. I remember warning at the time that we had to remember that the medal of freedom has two sides, and that the backside meant that freedom could be used and misused to settle old scores. That excessive nationalism that had been kept under lid during the oppressive years could resurface. That this could lead to politics where national minorities as well as neighbors were targeted, both in order to settle old scores and to cover for the fact that, everything did not go so fast or so well when it came to create a better future. And that's exactly what happened. And the scourge of excessive nationalism is now found in all countries, both in the old democracies and what is still called the new democracies, and in small as well as bigger countries. We find it in my country and we find it in your country. Now, nationalism does not have to be a negative force. Being proud of your nation and your heritage can be a positive driver. But if it leads to rejection of international cooperation, we have a problem. I'm sure that had Endel Lipppmaa been around with us today, he would have reacted strongly to the signs all over Europe that these forces are gaining strength. Europe is facing some very existential challenges. The traditional American leadership in the Atlantic Alliance has weakened, and traditional American leadership in the international organizations that the US were prime movers in creating after World War II has been overshadowed by the cry for America first. At the same time, we face a Russia bent on revanchism and lack of respect for the international order that Russia itself was instrumental in creating in the 1990s. Most of the agreements we toiled to establish during the last phase of the Cold War has either been scrapped or are just pushed aside, most dramatically when Russia seized Crimea and fought the war in eastern Ukraine. But we have also witnessed how many of the confidence and security building measures that came out of the Helsinki process have been thrown away. We have seen also how some of the agreements dealing with the nuclear threat are either scrapped or will soon expire unless serious efforts are undertaken by both major nuclear powers. All of this leaves Europe more vulnerable, and in particular the smaller European nations that are now the frontline states. Estonia is such a state, together with the two other Baltic states and Poland. And this is where the need for an active NATO alliance becomes so important. NATO has established a presence in these frontline states, the so-called EFP, Enhanced Forward Presence, and a limited number of troops from other NATO countries are stationed there as what is called sometimes a tripwire or a road bump, demonstrating alliance solidarity against possible aggression. If you mess with one country, you will be met by a response from all countries, one for all and all for one. I still remember one ice-cold morning in Vilnius, the day after NATO enlargement with the Baltic countries had been decided by the NATO summit in Prague. The American president at the time, George W. Bush, gave a speech in Vilnius, declared that from now on, anyone who made himself an enemy of Lithuania would also have America as an enemy. And the response from the thousands of freezing Lithuanians who stood there on the City Hall square, stamping their feet to keep warm, it was deafening. And on the wall of the Vilnius town hall, To this day, you can see the quote on a plaque memorializing this event. It is important that all NATO countries signal that this is not just an American undertaking. We are all part of it, big and small. The first time I visited the base in Tapa, east of Tallinn, I noted with pride the flags at the entrance to the base. First, of course, the Estonian flag. Then the Union Jack, because the UK was and still is in charge of the EFP in Estonia. Then the tricolor, as the French were about to take over after the bridge. Then the Danish flag. We had 200 Danish soldiers there, and we have that again today. And then the Icelandic flag. The Icelandic flag, Iceland does not have armed forces, so why was it there? Well, Iceland has a coast guard, and the coast guard had a representative in the EFP, so of course she should have her flag there as well. And this is an impressive signal that NATO partners do stand together, big and small. In other countries you could find the flags from Luxembourg and Slovenia. But this does not change the fact that the security of Europe depends on the American support of the alliance. And we have been reminded that this support should not be taken for granted. It is important that we Europeans show our readiness to live up to the rules and agreements that binds the alliance together. In other words, the days are over when the disproportionate size of the American column in the Atlantic Alliance compared with the European column is just something you can brush aside. And this example shows us that the core of the challenges faced by the small countries in Europe is this. We have to make ourselves worth defending, even when this demands an extra effort on our side. The same goes for the cohesion in the European Union. We may have all kinds of worries and reservations with regard to the so-called loss of sovereignty that is part of belonging to the Union, like accepting a special set of rules where we can be overruled if we try to make things our own way. But at the end of the day, it can only weaken the cohesion upon which we are much more depending than the bigger nations if we try to go it our own way. Look what's happening with Brexit. This is indeed an eye-opener for the smaller nation in Europe, or it should be. There is a price to pay if you want to go your own way, and the Brits, or rather the English, have yet to find out how big that price is. Not because some sinister countries on the European continent want to punish the English for voting Brexit, but because you cannot allow one member, or soon a former member, to reap the benefits on the expense of those who choose to remain. Of course not. It is not Christmas. Santa Claus has not moved from Greenland to Brussels. I am particularly worried about the way in which the EU has proved unable to tackle the challenge from those member states who want to go their own way with regard to democratic rules, while remaining in and benefiting from membership of the EU. Countries like Hungary and also Poland are doing exactly that, playing with democracy in a way that is not acceptable, from weakening freedom of the press to undermining the rule of law and using gerrymandering and other tricks to change the democratic structures. If I should have some regrets with regard to the enlargement process that culminated with the EU summit in Copenhagen in 2003, it is that we did not at that time create sufficient instruments to deal with member countries who forgot the basic rules once they were in. Well, there is an article that can take away voting rights from such a member state, but that cannot be used in practice once more than one member state goes its own ways. Instead, we have to hope that there is sufficient political will to deal with such members in a way that takes money away from them. I cannot see other ways to go. Oh, I'm aware of the havoc this will bring, but we cannot allow the disrespect for basic rules of democracy to spread. In this complicated picture, the role of the small countries is a clear one. It is in our own best self-interest to support the structures, both in the European Union and in other international fora, and to defend them from attacks from those who wish to turn the time back to a time where everybody believed they could make their own rules. Some have compared the present situation with the Cold War. I don't agree. After all, we had certain safeguards established in order to avoid catastrophe. A price was paid for that, as you in Estonia are only too aware. No, I rather fear that we are moving back to what we saw in the 1930s, where the lack of international order and lack of international leadership led to a situation where you tried to make your neighbor the loser, beggar thy neighbor, as it's called, and where this led, as we know, to poverty and social disruption, and in the end the rise of undemocratic regimes and war. Democracy is under pressure, not just in Europe, globally. The rise of China, democratic breakdowns in Latin America, plus the pressures from conflicts in Africa and the Middle East, explosive numbers of migrants and refugees, and even the risk of a war between two NATO members, Turkey and Greece, and then the uncertainty of where the United States is going. This all bears down heavily on Europe. And being small means that you are the first in line if the elephants start to trample down the grass. That would be a pity indeed, because small nations carry a lot of value if they manage to deal with excessive nationalism within their own borders. Let me end by getting back to the question of being small. I want to use a poem by our beloved Danish poet, philosopher, Piet Hein, and make a few changes to his original text. Estonia seen from foreign land looks but like a grain of sand. Estonia, as Estonians see it, is so big you won't believe it. Why not let us compromise about Estonia's proper size? That should truly please us all, since you are greater than you are small. Thank you.